start, and maybe some more will join us in process. But Jason, I think most know you and most know SSTI, but why don't you give a quick overview of yourself and SSTI for those who may not know SSTI?
Yeah, sounds great. Appreciate that, Brian, and definitely appreciate the opportunity to be on and talking with everybody today. So first, SSTI, we, like AURP, are a nonprofit trade association. We work primarily with state, local governments, institutions of higher education, federal labs, and other nonprofit government groups that are really focused on supporting innovation, science, technology, and entrepreneurship. So the groups that we work with are really tend to be looking more at the programmatic side of things. How do you help transform research into new products, businesses, jobs? And so we're looking at trying to help people, focus on how they can develop programs to operate them efficiently and effectively. My role there is the policy and development director. So I do a lot of the work related to different partnerships we have, some of the research that we do related to practices and whatnot. But I also particularly relate to the federal work. So I engage a lot with federal agencies as well as on the Hill, and very much appreciate AURP's support for the Innovation Advocacy Council that we have, which really focuses on explaining to members of Congress what the importance of the regional innovation economies that are in their districts are to the overall growth and economic opportunities for their constituents, and trying to help make sure that that understanding gets translated into really specific policy support for different programs that can build capacity for our members and for yours. And so this topic that I'm going to be talking about today is a poll that we conducted. In a lot of ways, it was a repeat of a project we did in 2015, where we were trying to look at what the general public's understanding of and support for innovation and entrepreneurship policy is. And overall, we have really, really strong results. Again, going back to 2015, that's actually only picked up since then. And really wouldn't have thought that the numbers could have gotten any better. The bipartisan polling team that we used says that basically they don't see anything that pulls in this incredibly high. So they were quite surprised the first time, and less surprised obviously in 2020, but quite surprised at this public support. So some of the ways that we've been trying to use this information over the past few years, I've been using it to really help fine tune the pitches that I'm making when I'm talking with members of Congress, well, more often their staff members, of course, and then also other stakeholders as well as the general public, trying to think about ways that I can get rid of some of the jargon, better explain what it is that we're doing. And I think that was the spirit in which Brian was hoping I could talk with all of you today, explain a little bit more about the findings that we have from this poll. I definitely want to make it conversational though. So especially since I've got a small group today, which is great. Feel free to interrupt questions. Happy to change directions at any point to dig in more to what I have or to answer questions about other things that might not be here. So Brian, anything else to that? Any other context setting or anything else you think would be helpful for people?
No, I think that's great.
Sounds good. All right. So bottom line, what we found from this poll was that 95% of likely voters supported a statement that was advocating for public investments in science, tech, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And within that 95%, 46% of people overall were voicing strong support. So some of the pushback that we've started to get because our numbers are so good is that, well, this is maybe something that people just view as fine, and so no one finds it offensive. But actually getting close to 50% strong support as well really indicates that people really do love the idea of having the government support public investments in science, tech, innovation, entrepreneurship, as well as no one finding it offensive. So really, really great support here. One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting, even back in 2015 and then in March when we did this, but perhaps is particularly useful given what's been going on more recently and some of the divisions and economic opportunity that we're all obviously wrestling with, is that there was really pretty much universal support for the policies that we were putting forward in this poll, regardless of what type of common demographic you would want to break down and assess. So by party first, we've got men, women, ages, white Americans as well as Americans of color, and we have different groups as well, of course. education level. So employed and unemployed, basically everyone is liking the idea of these types of investment. One other thing actually I should add here before going on, because I don't think I have a slide about it. One of the things that was interesting about the level of support is that fewer people thought that the investments that would lead to new innovation tech-based jobs would directly support them that could possibly help their children or grandchildren. So for the most part, the numbers were about in the 70s for people who thought that the policies would help them personally or people who are like them, but they still supported them because of the opportunities they saw for the next generation. So most often you see policy support really comes down to something that's pretty personal and selfish. But here, except to the extent that selfishness maybe applies to wanting to see your children taken care of, at least people were really seeing it pay forward to the next generation and still supporting at these levels. These are the specific policies that we have that we asked about. So I'll show you the general statement when we get a little bit more into the communications part, but those numbers I gave you before were responses to the general, a little bit longer statement explaining what it is that we were for and what the platform was. We then followed up with a series of more specific policy type statements of what we would actually do to implement that broader policy statement. And these, for the most part, had very strong support as well. So I believe this is ordered going from top to bottom here. The one that tests most positively is ensuring that the U.S. has a workforce trained for the jobs of the future. Workforce was number one in 2015 as well. Was not a surprise to see it coming up strongly here. Some of the ones, though, that relate more to a lot of the work that you're going to be dealing with, of course, number 3, this is basically an explanation of what technology transfer and tech commercialization is. So number 3 and 4 really both get into that. Number 3, a little bit more oriented to possibly also dealing with some of the regulations to make it easier for businesses to do it themselves. But number 4 really focused on funding programs that would help support commercialization. So both of those very high levels. I'll get more in a moment into why we didn't just ask about commercialization support. To continue the list of policies, other ones that show up as being relatively strong that I think would be of interest. Number 9 there in particular, increased federal funding for research, 87% strong support. One of the reasons why we were surprised to see this do so well, 87% of course, is that we included the word federal funding in there. Something that we saw come through pretty clearly in 2015 is that when you use the term federal, you're more likely to get a negative response. People are good with scientific research, they're good with medical research, but the idea of federal and research being in close proximity did not test very well in most cases. Despite that kind of history there, 87% here, still strongly supporting. At the bottom of the list, although still getting 72%, people were not for the idea of providing loan forgiveness for students majoring in STEM degrees. Not sure exactly what's going on here. Obviously, 72% is still relatively strong. It is a few percentage points higher. My personal suspicion is that in March, this is coming off of a Democratic primary season where many of the candidates were for some sort of low-cost secondary education and or loan forgiveness programs that would have applied to everyone. So in some ways, perhaps the idea of a STEM forgiveness program actually was coming across as more restrictive, and maybe that's why it's 15 points lower than anything else. But again, it was the lowest one in 2015 as well, and instead still did see some increased support this time around. Here is the actual statement that we gave to people. And what I want to highlight with this here is, so we called this program ISTEP, the Innovative Science and Technology for Economic Prosperity Initiative. So we gave people a little bit of a long statement, as you can see, that they could read to go through. What we tried to build for them was setting up good. So the idea that America is doing so well, essentially number 1 by many different metrics of science innovation, but pointed out to them that we currently have a problem. And that problem in this case is that we're not always translating that research into new products and benefits for the American people. Our call to action there was that we need to have a new approach, and we're defining it as ISTEP, and then explain to people what we thought would happen. It would convert the nation's strength in research and new businesses and jobs. So we had the advantage of being able to give people a little bit of a long prompt. And really, as we see it, the challenge for us is trying to figure out how we can kind of put together this sort of appeal in shorter forms when we need to going forward. But when we have the opportunities to have our, longer reports, other communications pieces that we have, trying to build through this kind of platform or this description of what our field is trying to accomplish clearly is testing quite well. So it's something that we're going to be relying on to an increasing degree going forward. One other point that I'll say about this, we tested this not only through the question that I showed you before that got the 95% support, but both in a focus group before the poll, as well as actually during the online poll itself. We had people do dial testing of this, essentially, so they were able to show how positive or negative the response was as they read through it. They could dial it up or down depending on what the reaction was. And just like we had wanted, people would respond very positively to the first half of that paragraph. They then feel much worse about it, as we wanted them to, through the bad part. And then by the end, they were feeling very good about it again. So that seemed to clearly demonstrate that we were also getting that emotional response that we were hoping to elicit. The other part of what they read and were responding to is we did give people a rougher version of some of those policy statements that I showed you before to show them that we did have some more thinking behind what we were doing, and that it wasn't just a general statement of feel good things. As someone that I was discussing this with put it, it's not all mom and apple pie. There were some additional details here with it as well. So part of the study that we did was digging into some specific commonly used phrases. So I've pulled out a selection of those here that I think are particularly common and problematic and wanted to get into. So one, I mentioned before that even though we were describing commercialization in the policy statements, we very specifically did not use that term. And this is why. We saw very similar responses coming out in 2015 as well. People don't respond well to the term commercialization. And actually, to dig into that a little bit further, and then I'll go back to that chart, people very clearly don't understand the difference between commercialization and commercialism. So incredibly, both in 2015 and in 2020, during the focus group, people said that commercialization is part of what's destroying the Christmas season. So that type of comment, ads during the Super Bowl came up this time. I think the same restaurants in every town was one of the comments people had 5 years ago. Talked about selling out, making commercials. People just really don't like the idea of it. For the most part, people aren't getting it. Again, 12% very favorable, 35% somewhat, 32% unfavorable, and almost 20% having no opinion. So this is clearly a term that's not resonating very well. Technology transfer, actually, even though that's a term that should be avoiding the commercialism aspects of that commercialization has with it, technology transfer isn't doing a whole lot better. You get a few percentage more positive about it, a lot more people who are confused about what we mean, and still more negatives than we would really like to see as well. So unfortunately, we haven't figured out a very good pithy phrase to replace that with. Instead, when I now talk about technology transfer or commercialization, what I tend to say is converting or transforming research into new products, jobs, and services, or new products, jobs, and businesses, kind of depending on the point that I'm trying to get to. But that phrase about converting research is one that seems to resonate with people much more successfully. And I will say that since this is something that came out of 2015, I've been using it on the Hill now for several years myself, and it has been much more effective, I think, because even sometimes when you get political staff who are on the science committee, unfortunately, they don't always have a real deep understanding of exactly what it is we're talking about. So explaining that what we're focused on is converting research into new products and jobs, they get that idea, even if they have no idea what I mean by technology commercialization. So trying to just get rid of that jargon, something that I think we all kind of know intuitively in our heads, but these types of results have really pushed me on that a lot more.
Has any university created the converting research office instead of the tech transfer office?
We have not seen that yet. No.
Okay, no. Illinois, here's your chance.
I mean, I would just say that this is an audience thing for us. I mean, internally, we use technology commercialization. Externally, I try to use as little jargon as possible. And I will say that it's an uphill battle because there are still, people in our organization, and not intentionally. It's just the language that they're, trying to break people of getting people to understand the language that they're comfortable with is not the language that other people are comfortable with. So anyway, we're working on it all the time.
It is definitely a huge challenge. And your point about audience definitely is very important. When we're just speaking internally as STI and with our members, I still feel comfortable using commercialization, of course. Although I will say that there are many times where we see programs or offices that are blending these terms already. And sometimes it can even be a little bit confusing with people who kind of know, because they might really only be talking about licensing, which is generally transfer, but they're calling it commercialization. And, that's fine to a degree, but sometimes you can see some slippage even among people who know. But more broadly speaking, I think using them internally is still fine. I think the biggest thing for us has been reminding everyone that some of those groups that you might think of as being stakeholders and might being someone who's in the know might not be as much as you think. And so, especially with politicians, I think that, or with their staff as well, I think that can be a real gray area, and you have to really know if that person is actually up to speed or not. So a couple of other ones that came out and were pretty interesting here. One, and we did a couple of oversamples in a few states, and some of the results were different. Kind of emphasize, I should say, this finding about small business. But one thing to point out is that more people are comfortable with the term small business than with entrepreneurship or startup companies. It isn't by a huge amount, but you can see that small businesses have about 20% more very strong reactions and fewer people who are confused by the term than entrepreneurship or startup companies. And so, particularly in some of our public documents, I've been referring a little bit more now to innovation and tech-driven small businesses rather than talking about entrepreneurs or startups in particular, trying to just make sure that we're not tapping into any potential confusion that is, coming up from those other terms. That might be a little bit oversensitive. Again, there's clearly not a very strong negative reaction here, but I think there's enough of a something there to be aware of it, and have that in your mind as well, I think. One other one wanted to highlight for you all that I thought was very interesting was the term economic development. We were very surprised to see economic development coming out so favorably. So 88% overall were at least somewhat favorable, 48% very favorable when they heard the term economic development. What we thought was really interesting, though, is that from the focus group results, when we got people to give their actual reactions, what terms they associate with economic development, that's the list that you're seeing on the slide here in front of you. And for the most part, it seems that people are more thinking of just what the terms economic and development mean to them, not necessarily what they're thinking about of the field of economic development. And so I think that was something interesting to keep in mind as well. So people have a very strong positive reaction to the idea that we're going to do economic development in our community, but they might not necessarily be thinking of giving tax incentives to companies to relocate. They're thinking that we're talking about things like helping middle-class jobs, making the area more affordable for people to live in, and technology and advancing the economy came up as well. So I thought that was also really interesting. We're sometimes sensitive about talking about economic development in some of our public materials, in part because you see some pushback against the incentive ideas, in part because when you try to compare the work that we're doing for, I'm just going to go ahead and say commercialization versus a tax incentive to bring in a big warehouse, call center, whatever it may be, we're not able to really compete effectively on jobs, right? And so we don't always want to be lumped in with the economic development community. But clearly, some of that baggage doesn't seem to be hanging on to the term when you're talking to the general public, at least. All right. So again, happy to talk a little bit more about other terms or things that we had found, but the one other point I just wanted to make sure that I made for today, some details in the method. So again, this is building on a 2015 poll that we had. We had also done a focus group both before the 2015 and before this poll. We had a national sample of 800 voters. That was March 17th to 21st. The likely voters piece means that we did, like many political polls do, a double screen to get rid of people who aren't very likely to participate. Again, we did have, and I can't share it, but we did have extra polling that was done in several additional states that very much validated this. We looked at it at both a much larger polling sample of about 3,000 voters versus just a national one of 800. There were no significant differences, so we decided to leave it clean for everyone and just talk about the national sample. And again, we used the bipartisan polling team. Those are the companies there.
Great. Thanks, Jason. So I had a couple, so this is
Sorry, these are just links that people have and that you can share for people who want more background on the poll.
So, well, two questions. One is, you know, I've been watching bio, and bio's been doing a little bit of polling as well for, you know, the bio industry. And, you know, they are seen as part of the pharmaceutical industry, which doesn't have the greatest reputation given cost of drugs and things like that. But at least some of the data I saw more recently, now that, you know, you have groups working together to perhaps create a vaccine or certainly working on therapeutics for COVID-19. I suppose your polling wasn't as recent for COVID that you could pick up anything, but I'm just curious, any reaction to kind of the switch now that people want in this case, the bio industry to create a new vaccine, and they're saying, have at it. Any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually did do testing around biotechnology as a term. That one did reasonably well, but people were a little bit confused about it. So particularly from the focus, we got a relatively large number of people who weren't sure exactly what they thought. During the focus group, we had a mix of people who maybe were coming at the term from more of a sci-fi movie side, where they were talking about creating Godzillas and things like that, as well as people who were coming at it from more of a medical side and seemed to be more positive. So that's very specifically the term biotech, which I would argue comes out as jargony. When we did the 2015 polling medical research, we talked a little bit more about treatments then with some of our terms, and the numbers on those were very, very strong. So people are definitely positive. I suspect that pharma would be a very mixed to negative term. And I think that even if that would be doing better now, I'd be concerned about how long that bump is going to last between whatever ends up happening with charges and fees. And even if it's going to the government, I've already seen some news articles about how much government or insurance is getting charged for prescriptions. I thought it was really interesting. I participated yesterday in the DC chapter of the Technology Transfer Society's call. And Stephen Ezell, who some of you may know with ITIF, was talking about Buy-Dole and its importance. And he received questions from, it was probably only from several people, but repeated questions really pushing him on how much of a profit margin pharma was able to get off of publicly funded research. And so for that conversation even be getting so heated in this relatively very inside group, I thought was very interesting. And again, it might be coming from a small group of people, but I expect there's probably a bubble there. As far as pharma specifically is concerned, I think biotech is a term that we probably should be careful with, but certainly medical sciences, I think, is only going to be doing better from, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I was on that webinar as well, and I was a little surprised at the questions because I thought that would be a very pro Buy-Dole, and I'm very pro Buy-Dole, by the way, regardless. Okay, well, let me open it up. Questions from the audience.
So I'm sorry, I had to step away for a minute and missed a few slides actually talking about a grant application regarding technology commercialization. So anyway, SBIR stuff. But have you been paying I know that in some of the communications, so I'm part of the university chief communication officers at U of I. And anyway, they have been presenting us with data that APLU has been doing since COVID kind of started related to higher education and the reaction of the public in terms of as a trusted entity. And I'm just curious if you've been following any of that and how that sort of plays into some of this, because I think that we sometimes, I know in the earlier slides you mentioned university and whatever, but it just seems like we sometimes undersell our relationship to the university at times and some of this stuff.
Yeah, university is definitely an interesting one. We did actually ask about university and community college, and community college scored a little bit better. And in the focus group, people were complaining about universities being too expensive, not sure about the value. Those were some of the comments that were coming up there that thought were interesting. Obviously, had also mentioned if you were therefore then that the numbers around loan forgiveness are definitely pulling worse than some of the other areas, which I think is interesting too. I know APLU's been doing the work. I have not been looking into it much more than the headlines. My colleague, Mark Skinner, has been digging into it a lot more. And I know that he felt good about the alignment of what we were finding as well as the APLU studies. But since someone else in our team was worrying about it, I have not dug into it very much myself.
Okay. Well, it's just something, I mean, for others who are listening, it's some interesting data to look at, and I mean, obviously all these things have a little bit different of a nuance in terms of what they're talking about, higher education versus commercialization, but it's all related for us.
So that is a little disconcerting that community colleges hold a little higher than universities. That's an interesting data point.
It wasn't by a ton. Give me one moment. I will see if I can get that pulled up actually, and just go ahead and show that. Let's see. Sorry, this one. I'll share it a little bit more roughly in the actual PowerPoint view, if that's okay, to make this faster. So you can see here the numbers were close. Statistical significance is a little rough with online polls. Technically, would be about 3 points. So this is enough of a difference that that is significant, but it's not by a huge amount. This slide actually has the numbers on it. So 43% very favorable versus 36. Unfavorable number off only by 3 though. So it's pretty much the same. Basically all the difference was coming from people who were very favorable versus not. Maybe a little bit more ambivalence about universities as well, since 9% had no opinion. The comments generally, people talking about community college being more affordable, higher ed or university, being less, vocational career, tech skills coming up with community college. People, though, definitely seem to associate university, except for one guy who was a real treat. He had a very long series of great comments. Described universities as liberal brainwashing. This is the same person who I believe defined inclusion as fake liberal wokeness. So you can kind of guess where those perspectives were coming from. But other people were talking about it as ability to have a better future, higher education, future generations. So for the people who are thinking of universities, positive, it was coming out very well, but did think that this was an interesting component of it. Not terribly surprising. I mean, I think we've all seen charts about how expensive tuition has gotten for students, what the student debt load is. I would be shocked if that wasn't showing up somewhat in people's opinions of universities at this point.
Yeah, but particularly research universities. And I'd be interested to meet the 1% who never heard of a university. That's, I don't know if that's the same person, but anyway, that could be in the noise.
Yeah.
What about, so converting research to services and businesses and jobs, et cetera. So obviously there's been some pushback, from the Schumer proposal by, some people in the academy that you know, they see that at the expense of basic research. And obviously this is an initiative that's more on the applied side. You weren't polling university research administrators or faculty, but clearly the public doesn't get that issue. I mean, that wasn't anything you were polling, or you didn't pick up anything on that. That sounds like pretty much inside the academy kind of discussion. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a fair way to think about it. We did not have down to that level of detail, certainly in the polling that we had. So looking at the policies that we were asking about on these two slides here, from a typical public engagement perspective, these are relatively specific, but certainly from the level of needing to actually write a bill, these are nowhere near in the weeds enough to do that. And so I definitely don't think that we can get into, but we could say with a lot of confidence that this shows that people support regional innovation strategies versus the Schumer-Young proposal for regional tech hubs. I mean, I don't think we have that level of, fine tuning here. Our question, by the way, that's essentially describing RAS, which is just horribly long and awkward, is this one with 87%. So, right, we're not getting a clear signal there from this. I think though, it's tough. So general public, if you look at these slides, if you look at what they're supporting, they're definitely liking things that are helping companies, making it easier for businesses to translate research scores, very slightly better, but essentially the same as funding programs that are going to do the same thing. Trying to help manufacturers score as well, helping startup companies scores really well. I think in general, you tend to see that when you take government out of your proposals, they score slightly better. So what I would take that to mean is that if you are kind of demonstrating with your policies that you're getting closer to providing the support to businesses, maybe that would score slightly better. But I don't think from a general public standpoint, there's going to be much of a difference between those again. From the university standpoint, I definitely know that gets really tense, understandably, anytime there's a perception that NSF's basic research funding is going to be harmed. That definitely raises concerns for people, and I understand that. One of the things that I think is really important, and it is in the weeds, and you have to have still some trust, but one of the pieces of the Schumer bill that I think is really important is that it does have a hold harmless provision in there. So if this new directorate would decide to give money to the rest of NSF to help further its mission, it can, but it can't take any funding back from NSF, and it's not supposed to get that money unless NSF's budget is at least what it was in the year that program would be enacted. And so there are several things in there, in part because they were warned that was going to be an issue if there was a perception of NSF losing its budget. So there are several things in there to try to help keep that in place.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the debate about SBIRs, taking money out of the basic research budget, which has been an issue for a number of years. But anyway, seems to have calmed down a bit, but who knows?
And that's a funny one as well, because I know some universities who have gone to the effort of calculating how they actually get more research dollars, and some of them have realized that they actually do better when SBIR is higher. I'm not sure if that's true of your very highest R1s, but at least some universities manage to run enough money through SBIR or STTR perhaps as well, that they even do better from their percentage increasing.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, Jason, thank you. This has been great. We're going to make this available to the AURP community. We had a good session yesterday with JLL talking about strategies for reopening, and yours equally good on public perceptions. I think our parks and our universities can use some of this information as they develop communication strategies and go after more initiatives, either at the federal level, state level, or even the local level. So any final questions?
I was just going to say, Jason, if there's any, I'm curious about the whole startup versus small business. And I think that there's this perception that all startups have this bounty of venture capital that supports them, which is why they don't pull as well. But if there's any, I'd love to dig deeper into that. I mean, I know that I've started to use small business much more in our communications, but I do think that it's, again, that audience issue where people want to hear startups, some of our audience wants to hear, I want to hear about all your startups, and then, but the broader audience wants to hear small business, so.
No, I think that's definitely fair. And your point about venture capital, I think, is spot on, because that did not pull very well. There were a lot of people who are skeptical of it. So it had net positive ratings, but it was not nearly as strong as many other things on the list. And so I think startups are getting tied up into that kind of perception that's out there around VC a little bit. I don't think it helps when you see many articles about, a number of seemingly ridiculous, I guess you could put it, inventions or companies or business models. I think that starts to get tied in as well. Also things like, I don't know if anyone's seen, but the New Yorker had one of their very, very lengthy pieces about an effort out of Utah around testing that was a partnership among several startups, and is it Qualcomm, I think, that's out there, as well as an event experience manager that had signed up with several states to do a new testing effort. And it plays very much into a lot of those tropes about that you also see around Kushner, to be frank, and his team, that people who didn't know what they were doing admitted that they didn't know what they were doing, but just felt that they had enough of a basic understanding of business that they could disrupt it positively. And it's a very lengthy piece about the issues that they ran into with probably not delivering as accurate of tests as more traditional providers had, and then not being able to deliver on the volume that they thought they had. And I just think that, again, you're not seeing a tremendous amount of difference here. There's a 10% difference in the absolute favorability of small business versus startups, but I think that those types of things are probably feeding into where that additional mix is coming from. That's my 2 cents.
I'll have to check that out, but it's an interesting dynamic.
Certainly.
Thank you.
And maybe it's confusing to people as well. I mean, small business, people get that. It makes sense, definitely, kind of internally. Startup company maybe doesn't make quite as much sense as new business as well, which I tend to describe using new business more than startup sometimes too.
Yeah, it's a loaded term, because small business covers so many businesses, and while they account for a lot of the job creation, they come in business and go out of business quite quickly, compared to the startup companies that we like to help support. Anyway, it's a complicated discussion, but I agree. Just make it simple and just call every business, including startups and entrepreneurial business, small business. And that's probably a good, overall good marketing strategy.
Fair enough. Well, again, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you. I'm happy to, answer questions if people have them as they see the slides are recording. And yeah, thank you again.
All right. Well, thanks, Jason. And we greatly appreciate you. Say hello to Dan and Mark and all the team SSTI, and good luck. And hopefully we'll see you all on the road or in Arkansas in 2021.
That sounds great. All right.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.